Hello viewers, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of the Rebound series. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. This program is brought to you in partnership with the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development. We are continuing our focus on the forthcoming national budget. Over the past few weeks, we've been focusing on a process to gather public views and insights on that budget that is expected to be presented later this year. Certainly varied opinions and thoughts and wish lists that came from people across the length and breadth of Zimbabwe. Today, we'll be unpacking some of those views, some of those insights, but also looking at what we can expect. And we do have an economic and market analyst in the studio to help us do that. My guest today is Victor Boroma. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you so much, Farai. Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Great. Now, as I've just mentioned, over the past few weeks, government has, or Parliament has undertaken a process of going out to different provinces of the country, speaking to people, gathering their views and getting their thoughts, opinions and desires for the forthcoming budget. Just to begin with, let me ask you what you think of that process. Do you think, effective, relevant in terms of coming up with a people-centered budget, or is Parliament merely meeting a constitutional obligation and ticking a box?
Okay. To say it's relevant, effective, or it's necessary are probably three different things. So in terms of effectiveness, obviously we're going to look at output versus what needs to be achieved. So there, obviously it requires a bit of knowledge, but what we can agree on is that it's a constitutional requirement for lawmakers to do that. That's number one. Then number two is that obviously it does improve in terms of inclusive governance. It enables lawmakers to be able to meet, ordinary Zimbabweans across the country, to hear their views on national development. And it also, importantly, allows members of parliament to be able to assess most of the projects that are budgeted for. So when you look at the 2021 budget, there are issues there are actually expenditure projects that were budgeted for, probably under the devolution scheme. So it's a chance for members of parliament to be able to assess and to be able to hear from grassroots, ordinary Zimbabweans, especially in marginalized areas, to hear their views on that. But in terms of effectiveness, I'm sure there are now political considerations that will come in terms of the budget outlay itself. Probably departments of the government that get more votes and the actual deployment of public funds.
Indeed. One of the questions I did pose to some of the participants and those who attended these hearings were, they are getting multiple views, thousands of people giving their views. When Finance Minister Mthuli Ncube sits down, he only has a finite amount of resources. The cake is a certain amount and can only be shared. That's all we can share. So he has to juggle all those expectations.
Exactly.
How easy a job is that?
It's not an easy job. For example, I will tell you in the past probably 5 years, you have realized that there's been a push by the industry, there's been a push by various production sectors in the local economy to streamline taxes, to reduce the tax burden even on ordinary citizens. But at the same time, you also have calls for increased expenditure on public infrastructure. So in an environment where 80% to 90% of the budget was going towards recurring civil service expenditure. So what it effectively means is that before 2018, a huge chunk of the budget was going towards maintaining the civil service as it was. So the only portion that the finance minister had was the 15% of the budget to be able to have social safety nets, to have infrastructure development, repayment of debt. It could be local or public guaranteed debt with the external financiers. So it's a very tight, space. So yes, it is a very difficult job to keep everyone happy. you know, you have got proposals of tax reductions, but you do not have proposals of where to get new revenue. Sure. So it is a tight job.
Okay. Some of the, again, key things that came out of this, I know very, very topical and very emotive was the issue of the health sector.
Yeah.
In particular, the fact that Zimbabwe is still to meet the Abuja Declaration, 15%
yes.
Of the budget must go to the health sector. Last year, it went up to 13%, up from 10.1% in 2020. Do you think that we might finally get to that magic 15% figure?
We may get to the 15% in terms of, you know, the budgeted amount. But now there's a big difference in terms of how resources now come in. So the actual amount that may be disbursed will be far less than probably 10%. Because of inflation. That's number one. Then number two, the government has more or less left funding in the health sector to multilateral and non-governmental organizations to fund. For example, if you look at what's happening right now in HIV and AIDS funding, you're looking at diabetes, cancer treatment and all that, you realize a situation where the United States actually fund more, you know, towards those causes more than the Zimbabwean government itself. So that is part of the problem that is there. The government knows that international partners will come in on health. You know, there are a lot of vulnerable, you know, societies among us that, you know, will justify the cause. So the government also knows that. So the actual amount may be far less than the 10%, you know, that would have been, you know, allocated. So we may meet the Abuja Declaration on paper, but the actual disbursements may be far less than the 15%.
You mentioned a very interesting point when you talked about inflation and the fact that the money that may eventually be, you know, rolled out may be far below the 15%. Let's talk about inflation again in the public hearings. And I distinctly remember it was in Chamisa Highfields where one of the participants there raised the issue that, look, we budget, or the budget is presented in Zimbabwe dollars.
Yes.
But in reality, the economy is operating on a dual currency, US and Zimbabwe dollars.
Yeah.
How realistic then is this budget if it is only quoting one particular currency, and the dynamics, as we know in the market, are so fluid?
Yeah, being realistic, we have to call a spade as it is. Budgeting is based on the formal auction rate. So at the moment, you're looking at probably 94, $1 to 94 Zimbabwean dollars. But the parallel market rate is $1 to 180 in terms of local currency. So that means there is a very huge premium that is there. So expenditure, government expenditure, is based on free market values. So that disparity alone tells you that it's not realistic. But however, looking at a government, we have got a local currency that is backed by various statutory instruments, and that is legal tender. So unfortunately, the budget has to be declared in a local currency, because we are not officially a dollarized economy. So it cannot be based on US dollar values. But obviously, as economic analysts, we can be able to do our analysis using market values. It could be using the official rate or the black market to rate to see that this is the actual amount that has been budgeted. But, you know, relevance, obviously, it's eroded by the issue of inflation. By the time we get to December 2023, you know, all the amounts that would have been budgeted for will not probably be able to cater for even 60% of what they would have been budgeted for.
Indeed. Then again, talking about relevance, you know, it then raises this issue that, you know, a lot of the time we place a lot of emphasis on who's been allocated what, which ministry has been allocated what share of the budget and how many billions of Zimbabwe dollars. But there are other very important issues, policy directions, confidence building measures, some of those things that are set or meant to set a direction or set a tone. I want to talk about two here and ask you about them. In the 2020 budget, 2021 budget, the minister spoke about, I remember specifically that directive was given that motor vehicles for use by line ministries and government departments must be purchased from local assembly plants. And I think the push there was to try and incentivize the local motor industry. I think this was also tied to the fact that a couple of years ago, there was a ban on or announced a ban on importation of vehicles more than 10 years.
Yeah.
These things have, I'm not sure to what extent they've actually been implemented or happened.
Okay. Yeah, to be honest, the actual implementation, like most of the blueprints that we have had since independence, we have got very good blueprints. We have got very good policy proposals. But implementation, like I highlighted earlier on, has got other considerations. For example, some of the members of parliament in the last 2 years raised objections to local procurement of vehicles. They highlighted that they would not meet the test of the local terrain. The local manufacturers have not been well tested. So they highlighted that we can only be able to purchase a portion. So on a positive note, you will see that there are various ministries that procure locally. For example, the Ministry of Defense, they've got several vehicles that they purchase from Quest Motors in Mutare. I may not be privy to the facility that they get, but at least you see those vehicles being used. So those were the objections that were raised by lawmakers. And you see in the market, most of the lawmakers have got imported vehicles, Ford Rangers and all, because they say they meet the local terrain. But our argument is that if, say, for example, there are objections in terms of quality, then the government should help the local industry in order to import the necessary technology, considering the fact that they would have guaranteed orders from the government. So say, for example, every year the government procures probably 100 to 150 off-road vehicles. If local manufacturers can be able to get supply contracts, say 20 years for these off-road vehicles, then they can be able to capacitate, knowing well that they've got an off-take agreement. So that has been part of the challenge. So implementation has got other considerations that are there, and obviously the prices that you have for these imported vehicles, and there is obvious these prices may be inflated as well. And you have seen in the past audits by the Auditor General, where part of these vehicles were actually that would have been paid for by the government were not delivered. So these are some of the challenges that are there, and obviously they would require good governance in terms of auditing and being able to ensure that part of these vehicles were delivered, and the quality also meets what is expected of government vehicles.
Given what you've just raised about implementation, how then do you convince someone who, a member of the public who didn't bother attending these hearings because they say, they believe that, look, my 2 cents is never going to be listened to, and even if it is, or when this budget is presented, at the end of the day, it is not, it is purely a projection or a budget, so that it doesn't translate to reality, and so therefore I shouldn't participate in this process? Yeah,
to be honest, it's a hard sell. Because what happens is you look at trend precedents, what has happened in the past when the public, especially ordinary Zimbabweans, gave their views, have their views been taken on board? So yes, it is a hard sell, and the only way to convince cannot be by more words. It can only be through action, and trust has to be earned through implementation of previous and current, policy proposals. So yes, lawmakers have to go through it, but unfortunately there is no magic to it. It has to be actual implementation to convince them. Let's take a short break, Victor. We'll come back, and I think when we come back, we'll now focus on specifics of what we expect or what you think as expert analysts should be contained in the forthcoming budget. This is the Rebound series. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. We do take a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Rebound series continues. My guest, Victor Boroma, is in the studio. He's an economic and market analyst. We're focusing on the forthcoming national budget due to be presented very shortly. The 2021 national budget, which is now about to be wound up. The theme there was building resilience and sustainable economic recovery. I must quote from what the minister presented last year, that it was based on the pillars where 7 pillars were inclusive growth and macro stability, developing and supporting productive value chains, optimizing value
value in our natural resources, infrastructure, ICT, and the digital economy, social protection, human capital development and well-being, effective institutional building, governance, engagement and re-engagement. I think a huge amount of very good and nice sounding words there. Let's pick apart some of these. I want to begin by talking about optimizing value of our natural resources. To what extent has that been done over the last 12 months?
So when you look at optimizing value of our natural resources, let's just look at the figures there. So if you look at Zimbabwe, 92% of our exports are raw commodities. So it's either raw tobacco or raw minerals. And part of the focus, you know, as you highlighted in the past 12 months, we have the vision where the government wants to realize a 12 billion mining industry. And part of the focus there is on value addition and beneficiation of local minerals. Unfortunately, we haven't had much traction, save for platinum and nickel, but nickel probably is not something that happened in the past few years. So the only portion where we have had significant progress made is on beneficiation of platinum. And when you look at some of the companies that are in the sector, for example, Zimplats, Mimosa and Unki, they are the biggest corporates on the local market, and platinum group of metals are now Zimbabwe's biggest exports in terms of value. So unfortunately, on other minerals, we haven't had such progress. For example, you'd look at gold. Obviously, you would look at some minerals such as lithium. We have not had such progress. Why do I say so? Is that the policy direction has to incentivize, value addition close to source. For example, you look at chrome. We've been exporting chrome to the Far East, especially China, in raw form. So what has been done in terms of policy initiative to ensure that local miners value add on the local market has been insignificant. So it continues to be exported in raw form. Yeah.
Good. Let's talk about ICT and the digital economy, I think becoming even more important now given what the COVID-19 pandemic has done in sectors like education and even people working from home. A few weeks ago, we saw the National Broadband Project being the next phase being rolled out, which may introduce technology like 5G. My key question there is obviously that's a good thing that we're rolling out infrastructure, we're investing in this technology. My worry is coming back to the people. What can be done to make these services more accessible? Because data costs remain high. Accessing the internet and penetration, those things remain very high. From a budget perspective, is there anything that can be done?
Yes, but unfortunately, probably we missed part of the train. So if you look at most of the developed countries, the government played a very key role in terms of broadband rollout. So in a way, all the players, private players that come into internet access provision or internet service provision would hire, would sort of lease, or would be able to provide those services utilizing government, fiber broadband infrastructure. But unfortunately here, our infrastructure was funded through the private sector. So obviously the private sector, when you look at probably Liquid Telecom, PowerTel, what they did in terms of investing, they would want to recoup. So how probably the government can be able to ensure that broadband and internet can be accessible? Obviously, it has to be probably tax breaks to all probably private investors that would undertake to invest in infrastructure development. So there are some parts, especially remote parts close to the border towns, that do not have sufficient coverage, and like you highlighted, data costs are also expensive. So in a way, probably what is within the realm of the government is to do with taxation. How can government be able to use taxation policy to ensure that corporates can be able to provide services at affordable and competitive rates?
Key points that also come out of the budget is obviously the projections for GDP growth, and certainly the finance minister has been very bullish about that. We also have seen the IMF expecting that the economy this year will grow by about 6%. They say that an economic recovery is underway. I want to take, in all our discussions, I want to locate it and bring it back to the people. I mean, these thousands of people that MPs met over the last few weeks, when they hear that the economy is growing, as well as the finance minister says, and as well as all you economic experts say. At the end of the day, if there is growth, individuals should feel it.
Yes,
they should be better off in 2020 than they were in 2021 than they were in 2020, by at least 6% if we are to go by these figures.
Yeah, true.
Is that the real? Is that the lived reality?
Okay. IMF has adjusted the Zimbabwean figure down from 6% to 5.1% in their latest review. Unfortunately, we are always focused on the figures, GDP, ETC, gross national income, and we are divorced of the basics that measure poverty levels. For example, access to basic education, access to healthcare, access to basic accommodation. Those are the metrics that we need to be, that we need to look at. So when you look at part of the figures that came last year from World Food Programme, where over 8 million Zimbabweans were, sank into extreme poverty, it means that there is a variation on the actual living experience of ordinary Zimbabweans and these figures. So what it effectively means is that there is need for the government to ensure, especially on the social safety nets, how do you ensure that the social safety nets increase in terms of budget allocations as the economy performs well? How does the government redistribute income from the wealth or from the big cities to the marginalized areas? So that is what the government should do in order to ensure that these figures probably cascade down to the ordinary person in Zimbabwe.
At a time where I would imagine the authorities or the finance minister might be thinking, you know what, let me increase allocations to incentivize and create a more conducive environment to the productive sector, so that the more they produce, eventually the more I'll have. So that may compromise the people-centricness of the budget. Again, a tough balancing act. Yeah,
it is. It is a tough balance. Like you highlighted, obviously, for you to also solve the issue of unemployment, because unemployment is one of the biggest contributors to the highest levels of poverty that we have. So industries and local producers have to produce at optimum levels. So for them to produce at optimum levels, probably you might need to lower taxes, but then the government needs money. The tax base has actually been, going down because of informalization. So how do you ensure you have got tax incentives, yet at the same time you also want to have maximum revenue as possible, so that you do not borrow and you do not print money? So it's a tough balance.
Last year, we saw the finance minister, you talked about high levels of unemployment. That brings me on to the informal sector.
Yes.
We've heard talk of, let's formalize this informal sector for many, many years now. A step, I think, was taken towards that by the finance minister last year with the introduction of the presumptive tax on SMEs and informal traders. Again, implementation, has that been done? And what has been the effect, given what COVID-19 has also wreaked in terms of people not being at work or being able to operate?
The effect was immediate. I can tell you that the levels of informalization that we have, we should be, I think, the highest informalized economy now. IMF in 2018 noted that Zimbabwe was second to Bolivia, where our levels of informalization were around 67%. But I can tell you now that the levels of informalization that you have gone beyond 75%. So because of presumptive tax, because of exchange control regime that you have got, you sell, 20% is converted to local currency by the central bank. So obviously, even big players that were formalized find ways to evade taxes. Corporates are now finding a way to supply, the cash and carry tax shops that you have got downtown that pay cash and evade all the taxes and fiscalization efforts that are there to ensure that they survive. So the effect has been negative. There are billions that are circulating in the informal market that the government would be happy to see circulating in the formal economy. But unfortunately, that is the effect of the taxation system that we have and part of the policies that we have, especially the foreign exchange regulations.
As we head towards wrapping up this discussion, again, something that dominates, lives in Zimbabwe, the discussions, the stories that make headlines in Zimbabwe is inflation.
Yes.
We've seen it consistently coming down over the past 12 months. Do you think that we've finally tamed it? And in this budget that is coming up, what more can be done to ensure that it continues going down?
To answer the first part of the question, to say we have tamed it, I wouldn't say yes completely. We have managed to reduce it. Last year, the average was 655% in terms of annual inflation. And now it has gone down to around 52% for September. So there has been a marked improvement, largely because the government has managed to rein in on money supply. But to say we have tamed it, I do not think so. Why? Because earlier projections, the government, through the central bank, had said that annual inflation would drop down to 10%. They revised it to 25 to 35% at the end of last month. Now, the projection is that inflation will, end the year above 50%. So the government and the central bank, as the key players in terms of money supply, they actually see that inflation is actually going to go down. So that means the projections show you that there is going to be money supply growth. And what does the government need to do to ensure that inflation is kept at the lowest levels? So as long as the government wants to maintain the dual currency economy that we have got, then the government has to be willing to allow, number one, free market reforms that ensure that the auction system is market driven, number one. Then number two, money supply has to be within economic growth, projections. Then number three is, how do you ensure that the public has got confidence in the local financial sector? For example, there have to be interest on deposits. You should make it easier for local investors to be able to, remit their dividends, and there should be free capital movement. So all those are the necessary fundamentals to ensure that the local currency has got a stable value. Unfortunately, the lines between the political considerations and the economic considerations sometimes are blurred. Political considerations sometimes carry the day than, good governance and good economic reforms.
Some would say we are still a bit far off from 2023, but some say we're already in election mode. Some say we never left election mode. To what extent do you see 2023 elections influencing what could be presented in the forthcoming budget? If
you look at it, 3 days ago, there was actually a notice by the Grain Marketing Board that the presidential input scheme in the Mvudza project should reach every farmer. So we are looking at probably 2.5 million to 3 million Zimbabweans having access to free, in some way, agricultural inputs. At the same time, you also have got commercial farmers, A1, A2, getting free fuel and other inputs as well. So what it effectively means is that there is going to be more in terms of more budget allocation towards agricultural subsidies, especially input schemes to rural farmers and maize producers. So what it effectively means is that there is going to be growth in money supply, and well, it does affect inflation, and it does create an artificial demand for foreign currency.
Let me ask you this. You've just said that, okay, we've been told that this is a bump. We've had a bumper harvest this year. That farmers done, agriculture and farmers have done extremely well. We know that GMB is paying a very, very good price, certainly much higher than anywhere else in the region for deliveries there, which means farmers are smiling all the way to the bank. Pockets are full.
Not really. Not really. They are not really smiling. Why? Because when you look at market rates that influence pricing, for the producer price of 42,000 for a ton of maize, obviously on paper it's $600, but when you use the parallel market rate, is less than 260 US. So they are not really smiling. And we all know, when you also look at the time it has taken for those farmers to be paid, so it might not be smiling. For most of agricultural production, you realize that viability is based on pricing. So it's not everyone who is smiling, especially cotton farmers, wheat and soya farmers. They are actually being paid an amount which is less than the break-even or the viability price. So it's not really everyone smiling.
The point I was going to get at before you sort of showed me that my train of thought was perhaps was, you know, it's a bumper harvest, farmers are getting paid very well. Why should we keep giving them freebies? Because we assume they've made a lot of money.
Yeah.
But again, coming back to the point that you've now just made, where some of them are below break even.
Yeah.
But they've been given these things free.
Well,
and if we continue to give them free again, how do we guarantee that they will come out of that? Surely we should be addressing the other side, not the supply side, but the pricing side.
Like I highlighted earlier on, our agricultural production and policies are very much based on political considerations. So unfortunately, it is the reality that is there on the ground. So they continue to get inputs, and their repayment model obviously is neither here nor there. You actually realize that most of white commercial farmers that are actually coming back to lease farms are doing better in terms of repaying these inputs than most of the resettled farmers. But well, it is what it is, and the government views that local production needs government funding. And it will take time to change that particular mindset, but at least producer prices need to be determined by market forces so that at least there's improved viability for the farmers.
Thank you so much, Victor. We must end it here because we're out of time. And I'd like to thank you for coming through and being such a fantastic guest and sharing those insights. Very, very informative. And we certainly hope that some of the aspirations and hopes that were expressed by Zimbabweans during those public meetings will make their way into the final document when it is presented before Parliament. Thank
you so much, Farai. Thank you to the viewers.
Okay. Well, that's a wrap for this edition of the Rebound series. I thank you so much for joining us. My name is Farai Mwakutria, and once again, a reminder, this program is brought to you in partnership and with the support of the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development. I hope you can join me for future editions of this show. Until then, do stay safe. Bye-bye.